The task, a true labor of love that has been assigned to me in the common reflection on the work of Ferdinand Ulrich, to which we have devoted ourselves in this beautiful event in Passau, is to endeavor to show his significance for philosophy today. There would be several ways to carry out this endeavor. One way would be to take some fundamental notion in his thinking, for example, the nature of freedom or the human word, and by comparing it to notions common in contemporary discussions, to show how his understanding could bear worthwhile fruit. Another approach would be to step back a bit further in order to allow a somewhat bigger picture to emerge and compare Ulrich's approach to philosophy more generally to other contemporary approaches, showing how he opens a uniquely promising way forward. Here we could see, for example, how he allows a recovery of metaphysics in a genuine sense that outwits the critique of Heidegger and his postmodern progeny, or how he opens philosophy to the light of faith, enabling the potentially quite fruitful developments of a biblical ontology, or even a Trinitarian ontology, without betraying the integrity of philosophy in its distinction from theology. These are all excellent endeavors, and it is to be hoped that these sorts of projects, which we witness popping up here and there in different places in the world, will increase and multiply, since they are indispensable labors in the proper reception of Ulrich's thought. But what I propose to do here is something a bit different. I want to step back even further in order to allow an even bigger picture to emerge. I would like to try to situate Ulrich's philosophical contribution within the arc of intellectual history, and even more fundamentally within the mission of the Church, which is itself an extension in space and time of the mission of Christ himself. There is, of course, a great danger of presumption in this and of being carried away by one's ignorance rather than being guided by genuine insight. Aware of this danger in my own limitations, I offer the following reflection in the mode of a suggestion, hoping principally to open a discussion and engage our common reflection. I will begin by citing a startlingly bold judgment of one of the most important figures in what would come to be the formation of modern German thought, namely Martin Luther, which was formulated by another close friend of Hans Urs von Balthasar, Erich Pschivara. In a particular text from his work on anthropology, Humanitas, Pschivara interprets Luther as representing a deep current in the Germanic mythological tradition, which culminates in the cosmic ash tree Yggdrasil, the naked gallows on which Odin hung. The connection to mythology that Pschivara sees in Luther seems to indicate that what is going on in his thought is a pagan appropriation of a central Christian mystery on the terms of paganism. Pschivara is suggesting that rather than transfiguring what Luther himself confessed as the, quote, profaneness hidden in my flesh and in my entire nature, the Christian event, as Luther interprets it, simply contradicts this profaneness. Luther's cross, too, is finally left naked, without the corpus in which salvation is achieved. Pschivara judges that this naked cross stands as something like, quote, a consummation of Albigensian Manichaeism, since material nature as such appears to be canceled out rather than redeemed. It's a harsh judgment, of course. Whether this judgment is true regarding Luther himself is a question I will set aside. as not relevant for our theme. Rather than read it as a judgment regarding the man and the thinker, Martin Luther, I propose to read it symbolically in an unusually robust and comprehensive sense. And I do so because it will allow us, I believe, to set into relief Ferdinand Ulrichs' distinctive contribution and his gift, which is yet to be properly received and unfolded in terms of the intellectual history of the West. My hope is that reflecting on Ulrichs' work from this perspective will bring to light the true fruitfulness, the culture-shaping significance of grafting the reason that constitutes the core of human nature onto the vine of Christ and giving it a true Christian form. What I mean by reading Pshivar's judgment symbolically is twofold. First, let us take Luther as a symbol, a decisive representative of the German soul, in the sense of the phrase that Balthasar employed in his first trilogy, The Apocalypse of the German Soul. Apokalypsis heißt Enthüllung, heißt also so viel wie Offenbarung, Revelatio. Offen liegt aber das Außen, verschleiert das Innen. Seele ist dieses Innen. The soul is the deepest interior reality of a person, and indeed, more broadly, of a people. But this interior principle is not an isolated, self-enclosed reality cut off from the rest of the world, what Ulrich will eventually call ich gleich ich, but is a way of relating to the whole of reality, an ultimate disposition, letzte Haltung, considered from its most profound roots. Wir sagen hier Seele, Balthasar says, und nicht Geist, jenes konkret Letzte zu treffen, das sich etwa in der Rede Seele retten statt Menschen oder Geister retten ausspricht. So, I am here taking Luther to represent the German soul in this sense. In him is revealed something of the deepest interior reality and ultimate disposition, letzte Haltung, of the German people. Second, in saying this, I mean German people, not in the positivistic, empirical sense of the modern European nation, with its particular history, culture, governmental forms, but again, symbolically, namely, as indicating that the German people play a distinct role in the larger Christian mission to bring the gospel to the ends of the earth, or in other words, to gather up the whole of reality into the body of Christ. There is no room in the present context to lay out a full account on this score. I can only make a proposal regarding the role of the German within the church's, the Germanic, I should say, within the church's overall mission. But I offer it here again simply as a perspective to consider together. It seems to me that the Germans, the Germanic tribes, represent something like the matter to which the Christian form, specifically in relation to, like the matter to the Christian form, specifically in relation to the realization of a Christian world. This is clearly evident in the formation of Europe. But I'm suggesting that the Germans represent a principle at play in all enculturation of the faith, or in other words, in all realization of the church in history, no matter what part of the world in which it occurs. As many others have observed, and I have elaborated in other places, the distinctively Christian form of culture arose as something like a transformative synthesis of the Greeks, the Romans, and the Jews. Physis, the Greek word for nature, nomos, for law or culture, and theos, for God. So Greeks, Romans, and Jews, a form of existence that includes the world or cosmos, man, and relation to God. So Christianity is not simply a faith which individuals keep in the privacy of their homes or simply their hearts. Instead, God's self-revelation in Christ is a revelation of the inner life of God. That's what the word theology means. The inner life of God, to be sure, but therefore, at the same time, a revelation of the ultimate meaning of things, a cosmology and metaphysics that bears on man and the institutions he creates in his existence in common with others. So an anthropology and a metaphysics and economics and so forth. One might say, as the fathers did, that it is not an accident that Christianity arose when it did in history, not only to fulfill the law and the prophets, but at that very moment in which Rome was building its roads throughout the known world and using them in part to communicate the Greek culture it had appropriated. So all of that is very briefly and succinctly condensed. But this form, the transformative convergence of these three cultures, did not exist in abstraction, hovering over the world as a mere ideal. If the church initially sprang up as a somewhat hidden presence inside of a larger reality, as we know from within the catacombs in Rome, it had its most paradigmatic realization in Christendom, in which Christianity did indeed give the form of Christ, to varying degrees of success in different places, to be sure, to the whole of human life. The concrete reality of Christendom introduced a further reality to the triad, namely the German tribes who were already there, the native peoples scattered throughout Europe. The church, therefore, became an actual reality, not just a private faith, but a comprehensive way of life, to the extent that its form was received by these peoples. So the same form realized in profoundly different ways according to the particularities of the tribes in question, their temperament, history, institutions, and practices. In short, their native life and spirit. This is what I mean by saying that the Germans, the Germanic tribes, or peoples, represent the matter to the Christian form. That form, to the extent that it actually exists in history, is always embedded in a distinctive way according to how it is received in each case. Now, we can connect this point with what was said earlier about the soul. The material principle of culture is the innen, the concrete letzte, the deep, essentially hidden source of life, which takes form as it rises up to manifestation and fills that form with its original creative energy. It gives the form Wucht, as the Germans say, and as no word in English can capture. From this perspective, we can associate the Germanic spirit with the inner longing for form. Not, if we take our bearings from Ulrich, in the sense of a pure neediness, nur Armut, as he says, but in the sense of a poverty that is always already rich and a wealth that is thoroughly poor and so ever receptive, an openness. This is a properly generative, a creative longing. We might think of the curious language of the frogs, which Ulrich elaborates in his ingenious meditation on the Grimm brothers' fairy tale, The Three Languages. The frogs represent something like a material principle, helping to generate novel forms from below, from the creative depths of living matter. As we all recognize, the Germans have a native love of nature, of the natural and organic, of what comes from the home. One's land, what is one's own? However much the history of the 20th century may have cast a shadow on this love, the Germans, after all, gave birth to the Romantic movement, which was exported, so to speak, to the English through Schelling's one-time student Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It's not an accident, I think, that the Germans have felt a special connection with the Greeks, who also can be said to define themselves by the principle of nature, as the political philosopher Leo Strauss claimed. Perhaps we might say that the Germans represent nature in a more chthonic sense, a more visceral, material sense, and the Greeks in a more Olympian sense, though of course these ought not to be so clearly separated, as Nietzsche pointed out. A well-known American scholar published a book years ago with the title, Germans and Other Greeks. It's a good book, actually. We see the connection, of course, in the momentous cultural movement stemming from Winckelmann and reaching a particular poignant expression in Hölderlin. One might interpret Heidegger along just these lines, clarifying resolutely in one direction what remained an abiding ambiguity and internal conflict in the poet, as Balthasar has shown, Apollo or Christ. Heidegger is a thinker who sought to isolate the relationship between the Germans and the Greeks, purifying a now neo-pagan natural impetus from the deep alliance with the Romans and the Jews entailed in the properly Christian form. Reckoning with Heidegger is thus a critical moment in the etymological sense, krisis, kritain, in determining the relation between nature and grace. I will come back to this point. In the meantime, this brings us directly back to Pshiva's judgment of Luther, which we can now appreciate in its full symbolic resonance. In Pshiva's reading, at least, Luther represents a profaneness hidden in the flesh and in nature, which is to say, at bottom, an unredeemed pagan soul. Now again, I'm making no judgment of the accuracy of what he says about Luther. I'm taking this as a symbol that bears on the cultural movement. The question that arises with respect to this stance is whether the Christian form is able to reach all the way down into the innermost core of the soul, the innermost reality of nature. For this to occur requires a nature that is open from its very foundation to receive form, to receive what is given from above. Open not in the merely negative sense of a pure passivity that as such represents no obstacles. As Ulrich explains, the mere emptiness of mere possibility is a sign of sterility, ultimately an inability properly to receive. Instead, material nature must be open in the positive sense of love, of generous desire that is both poor and wealthy at once. Setting aside, again, how Luther himself, in the various nuances of his extraordinarily rich thought, would resolve this question, we can say that, viewing the matter symbolically, he seems to present a despair regarding nature's openness, which requires grace to operate, as it were, in spite of nature's own contribution. The famous image of forensic justification as the snow covering a dung heap, which is not transformed from within, but simply buried, implies a concept of nature that is essentially closed in on itself, which tends of its own inner logic to take a variety of problematic forms. We have here a soul that remains untouched in its core by grace, which means a resistance a closed indifference to Christ, lies untroubled below the surface, ever ready to show itself at any moment, whether in a passive or an aggressive way. The question thus remains, can the Christian form reach into the most interior, most intimate, most determinative heart, the concrete letzte of the soul, of nature, of reason? This sense of the self-enclosure of the innen has profound and significant implications for culture and history. There would be a great deal, immense amount to contemplate here, but I will take a single event in the intellectual history of Germany to illustrate the point, since this event will set us up nicely to see the significance of Ferdinand Ulrichs' work. The event I have in mind is the so-called Pantheismusstreit at the end of the 18th century, which bore the fruit of the Atheismusstreit that took place in the German Academy in the 19th century. To go straight to the point, the original dispute arose in a conversation between Lessing, just before the end of his life, and Jacobi, in which Lessing expressed his conviction that Spinoza had brought reason to its perfect completion, to such an extent that after him, no other philosophy was possible. Spinoza was a controversial figure who appeared to offer a system of thought that was the most intellectually compelling alternative to Christianity that the world had yet seen. Because of Lessing's stature, Jacobi's disclosure sent waves reverberating through the intellectual culture of Germany at the time. At least part of the reason this disclosure had such widespread significance is that it was not simply an isolated individual's personal opinion, but, I suggest, gave expression to a deep current in the German soul, so to speak. If reason naturally possessed a self-enclosed form, then Spinoza's system, which proceeds according to the internal necessities of reason, or a certain kind of reason, alone, drawing apparently irrefutable conclusions from a small set of self-evidently true propositions, following the model of Euclidean geometry, would indeed present philosophy in its perfect form. This form, as complete within itself and so fully determinate within a horizon of immanence, would make no reference to a transcendent God outside the confines of nature, and at the same time would leave no room for anything like the freedom of the will, at least as this is typically understood. Lessing's judgment would thus seem to force a dilemma. Unless one were to call into question the assumption that natural reason proceeds by the necessity of its own inner logic and self-evidence alone, which no one at that time seemed prepared to do, one could either accept the system on reason's terms or juxtapose to the system another perspective offered by faith, feeling, or freedom. In the former case, we make our peace with what might be legitimately called either pantheism, the identification of nature with God, or atheism, the identification of God with nature. Jacobi coined the now familiar term nihilism to characterize this absolutizing of a self-enclosed philosophy. And he called for the cleansing of its pernicious influence from the university. A kind of paranoid hysteria followed his insinuation of its hidden presence in unsuspected places and his eventually successful call for the removal of Fichte from the University of Jena. In the latter case, we have what Jacobi called a salto mortale, a leap of faith, or alternatively, some sort of flight into feeling or the pure arbitrariness of freedom. Doing so, in this case, we may save God, at least in some sense, but we trivialize reason. Now, if I have spent some time dwelling on this event, it is because it serves to bring to a head at least one of the major implications of the matter we have been discussing. This dispute over pantheism and then atheism is arguably the playing out at the level of the intellect in its loftiest expressions, the very drama we described earlier surrounding the question of whether the Christian form is able to enter into the innermost core of the soul of nature of reason and gather into an intelligible whole its native impulses, or whether, by contrast, it leaves them finally undisturbed and seeks to supplement them with a new order. This is the leap of faith. In other words, the dilemma we described inevitably arises from a concession of nature as a self-enclosed quality, as remaining strictly outside of grace by its essence. The purely forensic justification of the snow-covered dung heap has its intellectual expression in the leap of faith that concedes the unredeemability of the rationalistic system from which it escapes. Jacobi, a Lutheran of a certain style, like virtually all sides in these disputes, characterized himself as, quote, a heathen in the understanding and a Christian in feeling. So this is the dung heap in the snow again. It is right in this context that I believe the significance of Ferdinand Ulrich's thought stands out particularly clearly. So finally we come to Ferdinand Ulrich. Rather than simply showing how some of his ideas open up ways to resolve controversies in this or that contemporary philosophical discussion, which one could indeed do at great length, it seems to me illuminating, as I mentioned at the outset, to expand the lens to its widest setting and see where Ulrich falls in the intellectual history of the West, as it's very simply sketched. For those familiar with his thought, it is not difficult, I think, on the basis of our discussion, already to recognize that he presents a beautiful alternative to the unredeemed pagan soul and to the bad fruits this soul has borne in the disputes of the modern age in Germany and in the rest of the world, really. I know of no thinker in the past or present who demonstrates more clearly and compellingly in both the content and the form of his philosophy that the Christian form can indeed reach down into the innermost core of the soul and therefore get to the very roots of human culture. The first thing to say about Ulrich's approach in relation to the foregoing is that he thinks of nature not as an abstract quality, but altogether concretely as creation, Gesellschaft. And he thinks of creation in terms of the gift of being, creare est dare esse. The notion of gift opens up a host of paradoxes, which, so to speak, spring from all sides of Ulrichs Metaphysics. The giver is present in any true gift. He gives himself in giving the gift. But paradoxically, he gives himself in his gift only when he gives the gift away, or in other words, truly separates it from himself and places it definitively into the hands of the recipient as that recipient's very own. Thus, the giver is present in the gift only if he is, so to speak, absent from it, and in genuinely letting go, he abides within. We've heard this many times this weekend. On the other hand, the recipient comes truly to possess the gift, to hold it as his very own, as essentially belonging to him, to the extent that the gift succeeds. But it is actually his, precisely, as a gift, which means as something not due to himself in both senses of the phrase, but instead as received from the other, and so in radical dependence on the other. The recipient has the gift as not having it, or in the gift, wealth and poverty, verwenden sich selbst füreinander, which is a phrase impossible to translate into English, which Ulrich got from Heidegger, actually, but made his own use of it. In terms of a metaphysics of creation, Ulrich explains that God gives himself in giving being, but this gift implies a genuine other with respect to God, and the gift of being is given away so completely, it is possessed as arising from the created thing itself, resulting from its own essential principles, as we just heard earlier. Being as sein transcends the particular existing thing, das Seiende. This is the ontological difference. But for the very same reason, it inheres within it as that thing's own. Esse is ascribed only to the existing thing. The ens is esse habens, again, as we heard earlier. As Ulrich puts it in 1,000 different ways, created things receive being only as already having had it. As is no doubt familiar to all those present, the drama of being as love generates a host of beautiful temporal paradoxes, which we unfortunately cannot explore here. But there are two themes that we must explore, given our context, though we can only highlight a single aspect among many in each case. The first theme is the implication of Ulrichs metaphysics for the meaning of matter. There's an analogy between the meaning of matter in relation to form and the meaning of the existing thing, ens, as recipient of the gift of esse. In a nutshell, matter is radically different from form. Ulrich will sometimes refer to this principle, matter, as non-essential, that is, as other than the formal essence, though he also affirms it in another respect as an essential principle. That's a sophisticated point. We don't need to go into detail. But that does not mean that matter has its intelligibility apart from or in opposition to form. To think that it does is to reify matter in itself, which is something Ulrich says both Scotus and Suarez do in different ways with many problematic consequences. Instead, we best see what matter is precisely in its most complete instance, in its having already received form. So what is highest reveals the truth of what is lowest without eclipsing what is lowest or merely absorbing it into itself. The distinctiveness of the lower principle, and here I'm speaking of matter, the distinctiveness of the lower principle as lower, the contribution that the lower makes and its difference to the higher, comes most clearly to expression precisely in its union with the higher, with form. So specifically in the case of matter, we do not come to understand matter best by stripping away all form, reducing our consideration to the most rudimentary level of materia prima. As the tradition has always recognized, if we remove all form, we're left with nothing. Plato said that we can grasp matter only by what translated from the Greek is a bastard reasoning, which is to say only indirectly, since thought is properly configured to form. But Ulrich takes this insight and carries it to an astonishing depth. The proper meaning of matter comes to expression indirectly in the highest, the most perfect material creature. Just what or who this creature is, we will see in a moment. The second theme I want to highlight here concerns Ulrich's relentless critique of the ultimacy of a self-enclosed identity, which he famously presents under the symbol A equals A, or in the context of the person I equals I. To grasp the significance of this critique with respect to our present concern, let us note the connection between this abstract notion of identity and what we have been calling the unredeemed pagan soul. Namely, the depth of the innermost principle of nature that lies beyond the reach of the Christian form. It remains, as we saw, simply settled in itself, closed off from anything that might enter it from the outside. This sense of nature as enclosed merely in itself, this unreachable core of the soul, is quite aptly captured by the symbol that Ulrich formulates, I equals I. In contrast to this, Ulrich insists on the basis of his radical interpretation of being as gift, that there is no point in the soul, no matter how deeply one penetrates into it, that is not always already in relation. This is not only because the other is always already present to the self, whether that other be the mother, and through her mediation the father who carries the child in her sheltering womb from conception, or most comprehensively God, without whose abiding presence no created thing would remain in existence. If we said only this, we would run the danger of falling into a dialectic between the self as self and the other as other, however subtly this is portrayed. Instead, for Ulrich, even the self in itself is already an I-thou, because the self exists as self by virtue of the metaphysics of being as gift, only as given to itself, and so only as received by itself. The dative and genitive lies inside the nominative and accusative, one could say. This is a deep ontological principle that precedes all action as its presupposition, agere sequitur esse, and yet, according to the logic just presented, it is most clearly expressed, most perfectly realizes itself, as we saw again, in the personal act of spiritual freedom, by which one accepts oneself, receives oneself as a gift to oneself, in receiving actively, through one's actions, receiving the other, esse sequitur agere. So this leads to a culminating thought, a culminating insight, which brings together the two themes just presented. At the heart of Ulrich's philosophical thought lies the perfect creature, whom Ulrich often refers to obliquely as reine or heile Endlichkeit. We might call her, in the context of our larger discussion, natura purissima, namely Mary. The Virgo Mater reveals the deepest meaning of materia because she lives most perfectly, being as gift. In the most complete contrast conceivable to the unredeemed pagan soul, Mary represents something like a pre-redeemed soul. Not in the sense of being outside the historical order of salvation, but instead being inside it in a mysterious way, full of the greatest paradoxes, in which we can hear echo the paradoxes of being as gift. It is the grace of Christ that makes her pure, and indeed has made her pure from before her existence. That's the Immaculate Conception. Even as the incarnation, by which that grace arrives, comes about only as the fruit of her perfectly free consent. So she is the perfect unity of esse sequitur agere and agere sequitur esse. She receives everything that she is and does to the very core, the innermost heart of her being, perfectly as gift, which is both fully hers and is resplendent with the radiance of the other. This gift is thus not imposed as some predetermined fate that precedes her personhood, but arises from the center of her freedom, which lies at the center of her being. There is therefore nothing in her, no deep nature that lies beyond the loving grasp of the Christian form. So in a word, my proposal is that we gauge the fruitfulness of Ulrich's thought for contemporary philosophy, contemporary world, by interpreting his Philosophie in Maria as a contrast to the dark fatedness of a mythological nature, and as more fundamental than the Luther-inspired crucifixion of reason. If we were to contemplate the significance of the figure of Ferdinand Ulrich within Balthasar's early project of the apocalypse of the German soul, it seems to me we can see that in Ulrich the German soul, and again, I mean by German, this innermost principle of nature, so a symbol for man's material being, man in his material core. The German soul in Ulrich is not a self-enclosed entity that generates nihilism, a perfectly immanentist rational system that is simultaneously both pantheistic and atheistic. It is not a tragic darkness that both needs and destroys form, as in Nietzsche. It is not a reinvented pagan lamentation of the departure of the gods, which awaits their return without hope, Heidegger. It is instead an ever surprised and always joyful celebration of being as God's gift, which magnifies the soul, and so magnifies reason and magnifies nature, because it is supremely poor in spirit. Heidegger represents perhaps the best example, or to put it in language we've been using here, one of the most recent symbols of the German spirit, affirming being as, in the philosophical mode, affirming being as gift, as gibt, in relation to the ontological difference between sein and das Seiende, which entails a radical disposition of gratitude, care, and custodianship. Denken als danken. Heidegger had some very beautiful thoughts. It seems to me especially determinative of contemporary Christian thought how one reckons with Heidegger, because it entails, whether implicitly or explicitly, a particular interpretation of finitude, of the flesh, and of the reality of nature. Does one destroy it with the great no symbolized in the crucified Christ? Or does one take up the hidden desire of this thought and purify it in a Wiederholung nach vorne? In Ulrich's thought, Mary can be said to be something like the ontological difference in person. That is, not as an abstract and ever-deferred possibility, but as a concrete reality already realized in history. She lives the ontological difference, not as a destined forgetfulness of being, but as ever pondered in her heart. It is profoundly significant that in carrying out the philosophical task, Ulrich does not go directly to Christ to discover the meaning of nature, but goes to Christ only in and through Mary. He does not substitute for the naked cross, the cross on which the fleshly body hangs, without first drawing close to the one from whom that body first sprang. If there were more time, we could reflect on how this point relates to the fact that Ulrich resists a facile supplying of theological answers to philosophical questions, but allows the philosophical reflection itself to unfold to its ultimate extremities, even as he does so precisely within the redemptive light of faith. In expounding this distinctive approach, both in the form and in the content of his thinking, Ulrich thus represents, to my mind, a vital dimension of the Church's mission, more fully than any philosopher before him. Thank you for your attention.